Good evening, and that was a little introduction to our Festival of Economics, which starts in a couple of weeks' time on between the 22nd and 24th of March. It would be amazing if you could join us online or in person. But before we get there, we've got another few episodes of our SCOTONOMICS podcast. This is episode 95. Hello, Kieran. Thanks so much for joining me this evening. Oh. Kieran, you've done the old. You need to unmute yourself, Kieran. Let me know when you're. Nope, still don't have you. Well, I'll just say welcome to everyone who's joining us. There you are. Yep. Welcome to everyone who's joining us on our platforms for our episode tonight. Hello again, Kieran.
Sorry about that. Sorry. So that it looks really exciting, and that's a great introduction to our economics festival, and I hope as many of you can join us. I was going to tell you that there was quite an interesting article in the Telegraph on Sunday about Rachel Reeves, who is potentially the next Chancellor when the Labour government probably get into power. It was quite an interesting Spartan photograph. It looked like she was sitting at the bottom of a swimming pool, and the title was "My Mum Showed Me How to Balance the Books in the Kitchen Table." So it's that kind of terrible, talking about a government as if it's a business or a household, which we all know is just not true. It's interesting. She's the creator of the term "SCOTONOMICS," but she's styling herself as an iron chancellor, it would seem.
Yeah. No, I saw that as well, and she looks like she's trying to be very much the type of chancellor that we've had for the last 25 years, and concentrating on this idea of a fiscal framework and when there's headroom to invest in the economy and when there's not. But I would say it looks like there's absolutely no difference between Rachel Reeves and where we are now with Jeremy Hunt. So it's hardly an option as people are going to the ballot box. Doesn't seem like there's much of a difference in opinion or in the framework or anything between those two, which is a huge disappointment. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. We've got a really interesting interview this evening, and I interviewed Russell for nearly 2 hours. I've cut it down to 40 minutes. So it's much longer. So I think it's actually about 45 minutes. There's a much longer version of this on our Patreon. And we also cover some of the other issues that we discussed in that big chunk of time I had with them. But we really concentrated on his view, his kind of historical economic analysis of what's gone wrong in the British economy over the last 50 years. It's really interesting. And I think the key takeaway for me is that I think too many people within the independence movement in Scotland, politics in general, are criticising Brexit as if everything went wrong at Brexit, and all we have to do is reverse Brexit and then everything would be fine again. And Russell charts that the economic decline goes much further back to Brexit. So it's a really fascinating interview. Russell is of the left, but he's certainly not an MMT economist or historian. And we had a little bit of a discussion around fiscal frameworks and areas like that. So it's a really interesting conversation. I hope you all enjoy it. Please do drop in your comments and questions, and we'll see you in about 45 minutes time. Russell Jones, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation on SCOTONOMICS. We've got loads to get through, and we're covering, I suppose, in detail, as much detail as we can, this absolutely wonderful book that you wrote last year, which was one of our top 5 economic books of 2023, and that's The Tyranny of Nostalgia. Before we go into the title and all the contents, I'd love to know a little bit about you and your background, and then what made you decide to write a book like this.
First of all, it's great to be online with you, William. It really is. My history, I began life as an economic historian back in the early 80s. That was my academic background, but I didn't really stay there for long. I subsequently migrated into finance when the opportunities opened up in the middle of that decade. But I was lucky enough over a few years before I made that jump into finance to be able to work with a couple of former senior government advisors, one of whom was Lord Plowden, The other one was the great Scots economist and public servant Sir Alec Cairncross, who was a huge mentor of mine, and I was a research assistant to him, and he gave me a real love of looking into economic history of the 20th century. I should also add that there was another great Scottish academic who was a mentor of mine, George Peden, who is now emeritus professor of history at Stirling University, but he looked after me when I was an undergraduate, and also stimulated a lot of the interest in 20th century economic history. So, I suppose what happened after that was when I got into finance and the city, my career, went all over the world, quite frankly, but I always kept an eye on the UK, often with my head in my hands, looking at what was going on. And I always really wanted to come back to it. And when I retired 3 years ago, I had the opportunity. And I think as well, the fact that I'd spent so much time abroad, examining other economies, other systems, gave me a perspective which helped in the process of writing the book. Probably made me more dispassionate when I looked at the UK as well. So that's really the story. I was an economist in finance for the better part of 40 years, worked in Japan, worked in the Middle East, worked in Australia, worked in London as well.
The Tyranny of Nostalgia. I mean, I got from the book, and I was thinking, you always want to try and find a title that sums up what your perception is. Is that it? Is that what you think it was the best way to sum up those kind of half century or those kind of 50 years-ish that we were talking about within the book?
I think all economies, to one extent or another, are prisoners of their own history, in the sense that the history of a country will, it affects ideas, it affects attitudes, aspirations, expectations, it shapes the institutions of that country. But I always thought that history seemed to play a much bigger part in the UK than in most of its competitors. And as a nation, we seem to hanker, or at least significant parts of the nation seem to hanker after the past and the supposed glories of that past. And I think that what that hankering did was it sort of sparked a bit of desperation in many ways. There was a constant or a repeated search for some sort of panacea, some sort of silver bullet that would take Britain back to its glory days, or its perceived glory days. And in that sense, there was a sort of tyrannical element to our fixation on history. And, it resulted, I think, in many ways, this desperate search for some sort of economic policy mechanism. And if you look at our history, certainly since the Second World War, the number of different policy regimes which have been presented to the British public as the answer is extraordinary, whether it's fixed exchange rates or it's prices and incomes policy, whether it's
privatization, supply side,
monetarism, and Brexit.
Liberation.
In many ways, Brexit is the most obvious example of the lot. I mean, it was extraordinary. It was 52% of those who voted basically screaming at the world, "Do you know how important I was?" It's an extraordinary statement of attitude of mind in the UK. A very good friend of mine said to me yesterday, he described Brexit as the most extraordinary episode of economic self-harm in the last 200 years. He said the only thing that he could compare it to was in 1860, Paraguay simultaneously launched a war on both Brazil and Argentina and ended up losing 25% of its population in the process. And I thought, well, maybe that was a bit extreme, but Brexit was a real emotional spasm and a desire to get back to some sort of past or perception of the past.
There was a line that you said there was too much conceptual inertia and hankering after the glories of the past, and this cast a long and ruinous shadow. To sum up that kind of 50-year period, are you saying that the problems that we've got today are due to mainly looking back to these kind of glory days and trying to find a position again, not even just an economic position, but a political position where Britain seems to be more powerful?
I think it has it plays a huge role, and it stopped us looking forward. And I think it stopped us looking so much at some of the more viable alternatives which other countries might have put into practice and into operation. I think it's narrowed our minds a little bit, but I mean, I would hesitate to say it's the one and only reason why we're in the sort of state we're in at the moment, or why we've suffered this relative decline. I think it's it's a very complex set of considerations behind it. But I'm sure that this attitude of mind has a lot to do with it.
What decline have you seen, and what decline have you charted in the book, very briefly, over that kind of 50-ish period? Well,
our economic growth rate slowed. Our economic growth rate, for the most part, has fallen short of our major advanced economy competitors, and a long way short of some of the more emerging economies, although you'd expect that. Our productivity performance has been disappointing. We've probably suffered more volatility in output than other countries have. We have suffered typically a higher and more volatile inflation rate, although there was a period in the 90s and the first part of this century when that was less the case. We have seen our share of international trade, manufacturing, decline persistently. Our importance generally to the global economy has diminished dramatically since the 1950s. We are now, notwithstanding the attitude of parts of our body politic, we're a bit of an afterthought really in the global economy. We don't really pack much of a punch. We're not really listened to with the sort of seriousness that we used to be. The decline has been absolute, I think, and it's also been relative, and it's spread across a lot of the, should we say, the standard metrics of economic performance. We've become a much more unequal society over the course of that period. If you look at metrics of inequality, the mid-1970s were the zenith of the welfare state, and it showed up. We had a very low level, historically low level of inequality. And then starting in the 1980s, we saw a massive increase in inequality, and that's never been unwound. And I think, again, that's something that rather sets us out from the average as such. It's certainly something I would consider is very unfortunate, and has had a lot of very negative implications for our political system and our society in general.
So the first chart I'm going to pull up here is the UK GDP, and it starts. The chart starts here. The chart starts just round about when you start talking about the economy in the book, so round about kind of 1950s, and you can see a relatively steady, consistent growth of GDP from the 1950s all the way up to the financial crisis in 2008, and then that period after it, I think, is, it looks very different in terms of GDP. Now on the show we often talk about how almost meaningless GDP is. But it is a nice reference point when we start looking at the overall production of an economy. So before we go into more details and kind of talk through, how does this relate to your story of this kind of gradual decline of Great Britain, considering GDP looks like it's a kind of relatively smooth and steady climb?
The 50s and 60s were in retrospect, something of a golden age, notwithstanding what I said about decline in performance in relative terms. We actually did quite well. There was no recession or major recession until the first oil shock in 73, 74. So it was a consistent period of growth. The problem was that everybody else was having a consistent period of growth and they were growing faster than we were. But actually, those 2 or 3 decades, we were doing all right. And, people expected that to continue. The 70s were a much more challenging period. As I say, we got a recession in the middle of the decade. We got another deep recession at the end of the decade. And we seem to have had more and deeper setbacks since that period. And of course, the global financial crisis was a very deep setback indeed. The worst setback that we'd suffered since the 1930s, frankly. So, that chart does kind of speak to what I've been saying to a significant degree.
I thought it'd be quite good to kind of start to shed some light on that ruinous shadow that we spoke about at the start. And you went back, we mentioned the 30s there, and you kind of very briefly cover that kind of pre and post-war period of the 30s and the introduction of Keynesianism, and how kind of transformational that was, not just in the economy but in economics, and how it reversed all this kind of neoclassical thinking. And you cover that in, it's a really good place to start in the book. And it kind of leads us up to the 1950s. So there was one area that I thought was missing from the context of this look at the economy. And this was the role of the British Empire. So I've got one chart here, and I think this is one of my favourite charts, and people who watch the show have seen this before. But this is effectively the public debt in the United Kingdom. And as you see, it's almost like 3 parts. The first part is before the British Empire, when the government was heavily in debt. The middle part, where the government is in surplus, is the height of empire. And effectively, the government was able to run a surplus because the deficit was being run by empire. And then at the end of empire, which you're seeing kind of post this 2 huge dips there, which are the borrowing during the World War, we start to see the government going into significant deficit again, or borrowing those periods of time. And the kind of clear historical economic evidence there is that period of empire was the golden period for our economy. And not the only reason, but I would say the main reason that Britain was able to have the amount of wealth and its position during the 1900, the 18 and the 1900s was because of empire. So that's my perception. So what was the context not to include that when you were looking at when you covered that in the book?
It's a very good observation, William. It is. I mean, in hindsight, and I've thought about this, I think you're correct. It was an oversight on my part. I think empire and the loss of it is implicit in a lot of what I've talked about. It's implicit when I'm talking about Europe, when I'm talking about the US, when I'm talking about the balance of payments constraint, which I think is, again, implicit in what you said. And when we talk about the post-war policy architecture, empire is there, but I think in all honesty, I don't draw it out enough explicitly. There's no doubt in my mind that Britain's supposed glory days, those days that I'm talking about as hankering after, were intricately bound up. They went hand in hand with colonial exploitation. I'm a bit reluctant to say that the end of empire was the cause of our economic decline. I think that, maybe there are some aspects of it which were negative. I think it's also very interesting if you look at what was happening at the end of the Second World War, the Americans were absolutely fixated on the destruction of the British Empire. Yeah. And in particular on the destruction of what was called the Sterling area, which was the sort of ring fence that was put around what we used to call the empire and the trading arrangements that we had with those countries, which were very much in favor of the motherland. and the Americans wanted to destroy that. Britain pushed back against it, and if you actually look at the outcome of that, it was a bad thing for us because it wedded us to a lot of really quite slow-growing markets. You know, the markets in places like Australia and New Zealand and the broader post-war Commonwealth were expanding nothing like as rapidly as those in Europe after the Second World War. So our sort of unwillingness to really abandon the sterling area, the Commonwealth, the sort of system of international trade that we'd built up prior to the Second World War actually came back to bite us. But I think there's a lot of other stuff that's going on which hurt the UK economy, whether it was in terms of industrial relations, whether it was in terms of macro policy regime and the options that were taken. You know, there's a lot of moving parts behind the UK's relative decline. But yeah, I'm quite happy to accept your criticism on that. It should have been brought out more explicitly than it was.
Certainly more of an observation than a criticism, because this is certainly something that I think that I wanted to make a more general point of, that when you read economic histories of Europe, any country in Europe, very rarely does it start or even include the huge amount of resources that were stolen, or however you want to phrase it, from other parts of the world to create the wealth that we have. It tends to start from, you know, the intelligent white man who decided to power an engine with burning coal to create steam. That's where all of our wealth kind of starts from, rather than the exploitation before that. So it was much more of a general point. Moving into the 1950s, we're still in this kind of Keynesian position where stimulating aggregate demand. We don't rely on the private sector to produce everything for us. We realize it's a big position for what made us abandon that kind of 150 years of neoclassical thought in the late 30s, you know, let's say properly after the post-war period, because it was about 150 years of almost unchallenged economic doctrine, and it was all thrown out for this short period of time. What made us do that? And then even more pertinent a question, what made us go back to all of that after the late 1970s? Great
questions. I think, you know, the Great Depression of the 1930s made everybody challenge the conventional wisdom, which was essentially neoclassical. And you know, John Maynard Keynes did a wonderful job at doing that. There's a certain irony that you know, while he was doing that in the 1930s, actually Britain really didn't change its attitude towards economic policy making that much. It was really only after the Second World War. I think what the Second World War did was prove that government can be a good thing. You know, the extraordinary mobilization of the UK economy during that period made people believe, I think, that you know, you could have a different approach to things. And then, of course, you had a Labour government which came to power in 1945, and it applied eventually a number of Keynesian elements of policy to what it was doing, and Keynesianism became the conventional wisdom. Full employment policy became the conventional wisdom. Why did the Keynesian era fall down? I think there's a number of points. First of all, just to go back to the neoclassical model, you know, there is a very powerful internal logic about it. There is an elegance about it. There is a mathematical beauty about it, which certainly appealed to a lot of economists. You know, neoclassical economics, I've always thought, sort of knocks off a lot of the rougher edges of the subject. It simplifies it. It makes it look relatively easy. And I think what that always does is it appeals to people because it can give them simpler solutions. I think it's wrong in that I think a lot of neoclassical economics is sort of Panglossian. It's everything is for the best in the best of all possible worlds, but it certainly appeals to people, and it certainly appeals to people on the right. The freedom of market forces, the small role of government, and so on. And, let's be honest, the Conservative Party is the natural party of government in the UK, or at least in England, let me say, and has been for the last 100 years. So I think there's always a pull towards neoclassical economics as a result of that dominance for the most part of the Conservative Party. Yeah. So that's one point. I think the second point to make is that, the Keynesians blew it. They blew it. They if you look at the 1970s, Keynesian economics left us with high and volatile inflation, volatile output growth, an industrial relations landscape that was a mess. It was a very difficult period for the UK economy. Twin deficits, having to go cap in hand, as the Tories like to put it, to the IMF. I think the Keynesians got carried away. They tried to do too much. It sort of evolved into corporatism. They got too fixated on full employment. They didn't worry enough about the supply side of the economy and the dynamism that you have to maintain. And I think they forgot a lot of the original tenets of Keynesianism. If you go back to what Keynes was initially saying, it was depression economics. It was economics to cure deep recessions and extended recessions. It wasn't really the economics of boom control so much. It was the economics of depressions. And what the Keynesian or the Keynesians who followed Keynes did was try and apply his economics to a situation of what was secular boom after the Second World War. The world economy was growing rapidly. Trade was being liberalized. There was huge technological catch-up with the United States. Europe was rebuilding, Japan was rebuilding, the world was opening up. There were a lot of positives. We didn't really need to be that worried about a repeat of the 1930s. But, listening to a lot of those post-war Keynesian economists, you would have been forgiven for believing that, we were back in the pre-war era, and we weren't. They blew it. They got it wrong. And, by the late 70s, the Conservative Party was once again looking back to neoclassical economics for solutions. The Conservative Party had been burnt very badly by what happened with the Heath government and the first OPEC oil shock. And they were looking for an alternative, and they went back to their roots, as it were, which was neoclassical economics.
In your book, you said that the 80s actually wasn't that much better than the 70s. And I think you said the best year for unemployment in the 80s wasn't as good as the worst year for unemployment in the 70s. And I just wonder, I wonder if 80s really was that different, apart from the policies that these right-wing think tanks were wanting to happen were actually taking place. What's your perception of that view?
I get very angry about the 1980s and the way it's presented, in particular by those who are right of centre, the supposed economic miracle. If you actually look at the facts, the average growth rate in the 1980s was about 2.75% per annum. Okay. Now in the 1970s it was about 2.25%, so not that much difference actually. But if you look at that period, it was an unsustainable boom that was bookended by two very deep recessions. As I mentioned, it was a period of a dramatic increase in inequality, which we are still reaping the whirlwind from 40 years later. It was a period where the financial sector was liberalized and actually ran out of control, and nobody ever really put it back in its box. It was a period when, and you hinted at this, spending on infrastructure was an afterthought. It was a period when we completely blew the windfall of North Sea oil. Back in, I think, 84, 85, North Sea oil output was equivalent to about 3% of GDP. And, the Tories blew it. They stuck it into tax cuts for the wealthy. So you got instantaneous gratification in terms of election results, and you got a consumer boom, but it was unsustainable. A couple of other facts which are never mentioned are that the inflation rate in the month that Mrs. Thatcher left office was about the same as it was when she arrived in office, and that was in double digits. Another thing which is never mentioned is that the size of the public sector, I think within a year of Mrs. Thatcher's exit from Downing Street, was about what it was when she took over. So, there are so many myths about it. It was not the period of economic renaissance which it is presented as. Sure, there were improvements in productivity during that decade, and they were quite impressive, but really you could argue, and some people have, that all they did was really take back the ground on productivity that had been lost in the 1970s. It frustrates me, and I remember when Nigel Lawson died last year, some of the newspaper articles which were written around him and what he'd supposedly done, I thought he was an appalling chancellor. I thought it was completely unsustainable. By about 1993, you had Ken Clarke and so on complaining that Lawson had completely undermined the tax base of the UK. And you had to have this 5 or 6 year period of persistent tax increases to take back what he'd given away in the 1980s. I'm sorry, I really struggle with the 1980s as this great period of Renaissance.
That is really interesting, because you're right. That's not a popular narrative, and as I tried to kind of allude to there, is that I think that's partly the case because the policies that the centre or the right were wanting to take place happened in the 80s. They didn't in the 70s. But I don't think, from reading your overview in the book, you look at the 70s and you say a lot of problems here, some good things, and you look at the 80s and say something very similar. It's not like there was this kind of clear 70s bad, 80s good, and I think that came across really clearly in the book. I think you've explained it even better there. And what I'd like to do now is start to look at some of these kind of neoclassical ideas, and I think a really good place to start is the financial crisis in 2008. So we'd had this market liberation, we'd had this neoclassical and sort of neoliberal couple of decades, globalization at its height, and then we got to 2008 and there was this massive crisis. And a lot of people, and I don't think just kind of heterodox economists or commentators, but I think even mainstream economists thought it's kind of time for a change here. Things are likely to change. This has been such a shock to the system in 2008. Yep. So could you explain what happened to the mainstream economic narrative post 2008? And let's say, just take us a few years forward. How different was 2008 to let's say 2015?
The first point I make is I was very surprised at what happened after the crisis. I thought that there would be a shift back to some of the older, more Keynesian ways of doing things. If you actually look at it, I mean, the resort to Keynesian economics probably lasted barely a year. It was that period in around the G20 meeting in 2009 where Gordon Brown, with the help of the new President Obama, sort of corralled everybody in to pour money into the IMF and help the underdeveloped nations, and also not to do too many stupid things on fiscal policy. But it really didn't last long. And it didn't last long for a number of reasons. I think, first of all, you had some very conservative but very powerful central bankers who didn't like fiscal expansionism. You had some powerful European governments who never really got Keynesianism in the post-war period. I mean, the economic model in Germany and France has always been pretty different to the UK or the Anglo-Saxon model.
Yeah.
I think you had Barack Obama losing Congress relatively quickly in his first term. He lost his majority and it went to the Republicans. They had a very different agenda. And so that period of the sort of Keynesian comeback was very brief. If you look at the UK example, we had a new government, a coalition government, which was headed by the Conservatives. Very different policy agenda. I think they ran a very good campaign for the 2010 election, which picked on certain aspects of Labour policy at the time, and it appealed to the population. They focused on debt and deficits and so on. I didn't think it was very accurate, but it was a very powerful policy. And lo and behold, we subsequently had a chancellor who was, very fixated on a much more austere policy. I think as well that there was a sense within the Conservative Party that they should do or run policy in a similar way to the way policy was run in the 1930s in the UK, which was a combination of tight fiscal policy, focused on budget balance, and very loose monetary policy, low interest rates. And they repeated that policy mix. I don't think it was the right balance. I think there was far too much austerity and far too much reliance on the central bank to carry the can. And that pushed the central bank into doing, some stuff that was a bit questionable.
Yeah.
It certainly was policy that had costs as well as benefits.
Yeah. It looked like neoclassical economics had failed in 2008. Yeah. And, I think you even had someone like Alan Greenspan say, we didn't see this. And the reason we didn't see this is because our models didn't include money. These kind of things that if you said to the average person in the street, they thought you were winding them up. Right. But, there was no credit. We didn't look at credit. So how could we see it coming? Because it wasn't even measured. And for me, looking back in that period, I was actually working for the Council of Mortgage Lenders and the British Bankers Association at that time. So I was right at the heart of that kind of how is the industry and regulators working together to solve this problem. At no point did anyone ever really question the economic fundamentals that were underpinning the way the economy was perceived or measured. And that's looking back, you were still in the financial services sector at that time, but why was this never even considered as an opportunity to look at the fundamentals and change them?
Goodness me, I was actually at Lehman Brothers for much of that period, actually. I hate to admit it. That's a firm you may remember. Yes. I did get out well before the end. I think we have to go back to the liberalization of finance in the 1980s. Now, there needs to be some perspective here in that the early 1980s, the UK financial sector was antediluvian relative to the United States. It needed a kick up the backside. It needed to be deregulated to some degree. There needed to be more competition and so on. We needed to start to, if you like, employ some of the products which are available in the US and so on. But it went too far, and it was a period of reform which just became embedded into people's psyche to such a degree that they couldn't believe that it could be wrong or that there could be anything wrong with it. So, the major government accepted just about everything that the Thatcherite settlement had done on financial liberalization, and so did the Blair and Brown governments. And in fact, one of my criticisms of the Blair and Brown governments is that the system of financial sector oversight was really not fit for purpose in the early part of this century.
Yeah.
It fell between too many stools, and I think Labour sort of swallowed the neoclassical orthodoxy of the time.
Absolutely.
Efficient markets hypothesis and all this stuff. There was too much credit. There wasn't enough or wasn't decent supervision of the financial sector, and it got a little bit out of control. I became at that stage a great believer in the economics of Hyman Minsky. I wish I'd known about it a bit earlier than I did. But I think there were some important things done in terms of, macroprudential policy and, the desire to try and make the financial sector safer by putting in new institutions and new regulations around debt and mortgages and so on. And I'd give Mark Carney a very big pat on the back for some of the things he did, not just in the UK as governor of the Bank of England, but because he was head of the Financial Stability Board, which was a sort of a global group of central banks. And he helped put in place some important changes on macroprudential policy.
Yeah.
But as Minsky himself said, the longer you get into the upswing, the more people kind of forget these things, and the more they want to start unwinding regulation and doing stupid things again. And lo and behold, by the end of the second decade of the 2000s, we had a US government that was undoing a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
And people forget. And it's very sad, but again, it's you have to come back, I think, to the priorities of certain political parties. And we had a conservative-led government here, and we had a very powerful Republican Party in the United States, and then a Republican Party that had a very right of center president. And a lot of the good stuff that was done on financial regulation was forgotten or unwound, or people just didn't take it seriously anymore.
Finish on exchange rates, because I was reading your book, and if I'd been a Martian and I'd started reading this book, and exchange rate was so important to the UK right through, whether to go on the gold standard or come off the gold standard, and whether to enter the European exchange rate mechanism, or when there was a consideration of going into the euro in the late 80s, and then again in the late 90s. It was exchange rate, and then all of a sudden, when we get to like 2000, no one cares about the exchange rate. No one talks about it. It doesn't really seem to have any kind of impact at all in policy. And I just wondered, kind of, is that just my perception, or is that the case? And then I found this kind of chart that says that, the exchange rate, and I've just pulled this exchange rate between dollars and pounds up. In 1975, you could get $2.50 to a pound. Now there's almost parity. It's 1.2. And this seemed like a huge problem, but for the last 20 years, we've never really spoken about how little the pound can buy compared to what it was a generation before. Has this narrative for an exchange rate disappeared, and if so, why?
I'm not sure I'd take the argument as far as you have, William. I think that the exchange rate is still very important, because the UK is a very open economy. And so the exchange rate is an important price. It affects an awful lot of things. And I think it has intermittently come back over the last 34, 35 years. I mean, the Liz Truss episode is a classic example of that, when suddenly there was huge concern that sterling was going to drop through parity against the dollar. So it does come back intermittently. But what is clear is that since the ERM crisis in 1992, we have not tended to have an exchange rate target in the way that we typically had for a lot of the post-war and the pre-war period. I come back to this point that, you know, we were at the center of the international financial system until certainly the mid-70s. So the UK and the City of London was at the center of the gold standard. We were then second in importance under the Bretton Woods system behind the dollar. We had obligations towards people who held reserves in sterling, blah, 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 blah. I think that what the ERM did, or when we got blown out of it, was to put policymakers off focusing too much on the exchange rate for an extended period. It was such a sort of searing experience that it was left alone. I
mean, I would remember seeing on the news, you would see the picture on the screen of where it was within these little bands, and you would see it kind of bobbing up and down, and it would often lead the news, you know, close to you know, the pound is close to the top band of the exchange rate mechanism. Then there'd be it was such a huge thing, and as I said, it doesn't seem to be anywhere near that center of discussion that it was back then.
I think that's right. As I say, I would blame the ERM debacle in part for that. I'd also say that what happened subsequently, and there's a huge irony to this. I mean, you know, we got kicked out of the ERM, and what we found was that just about the only policy regime available to us thereafter was inflation targeting. And what we found was that actually it worked quite well, or it appeared to. You know, we had this period from 1992 until 2007 called the Great Moderation, or the Nice Decade, whatever moniker you want to attach to it, where the UK economy grew pretty consistently and inflation was low. And, you know, it was supposedly a successful period for policymakers. And so, you know, exchange rate targeting was forgotten about. And even after the global financial crisis, it never really came back. As I said, its appearances on the news have tended to coincide with broader financial crises, such as when Liz Truss decided you could cut taxes in an unsustainable manner, and people got scared because the pound was about to drop through 1 against the US dollar. But it is a very different environment now. I wouldn't be at all surprised if at some stage the exchange rate came back into the policy making center ground. You know, goodness knows it's been there for so long. We shouldn't rule it out, but at the moment, I don't think it's likely, but it could well happen at some stage in future.
Well, I know if Scotland does become independent and if we have our own currency, then the discussions around exchange rates are going to be absolutely huge. Not because of the exchange rate between a new Scottish currency and the pound, and not just from the Scottish perspective, but also from the rate of sterling. One of the most interesting and important characters, I think, because he ties a lot of things together, kind of generationally and going into the financial crisis, is Gordon Brown. One of my favourite quotes was you said he has a constipated approach to apologising. And I think that probably sums up my impression of Brown. But can you tell me why he's such an important character and what we kind of learn about the British economy through looking at him?
Well, I have to say, I actually borrowed that line from my friend Alistair Campbell, who knows Gordon very well. But I thought it was such a beautiful description of him sometimes. But look, I have a great admiration for Gordon Brown, if not affection for him. I think that, you know, some of the positions he's taken were I would 100% support. I thought he was right about the importance of macro stability, notwithstanding our conversation that we've had this evening. I think he was right about UK entry into the euro. I think he was right about the global financial crisis and the response to it, at least initially. I think he was right about the importance of the union. I think Gordon Brown's wonderful efforts to keep Scotland in the Union may have actually been the decisive factor in 2014. And I think he did a great job of trying to avoid Brexit as well. Sadly, that particular effort didn't work. I'd also say that his efforts on global poverty are extremely laudable. So I have a lot of admiration for this man, and he stands head and shoulders above most of today's politicians, the charlatans and the pygmies and whatever you want to call them. This was a man of great dedication, great intellect, great commitment. But he was always a chancellor, not a prime minister. He couldn't multitask. He couldn't delegate. He struggled to trust people, and he couldn't cope with 24-hour media. I do have criticisms of him as Chancellor in the sense that I think he got carried away with his initial successes. I think he confused the structural and the cyclical. That's to say, he thought what was a cyclical boom was a sort of structural renaissance. Not the first chancellor to do that.
That's wishful thinking. It's wishful thinking, isn't it?
Yeah.
You wish.
And I think he got financial regulation wrong. I mentioned that there was deregulation went far too far, and Labour did virtually nothing to rein it in ahead of 2007. So, I think he's a bit of a tragic figure, actually. He got rather consumed by his own paranoia in the end. But I have huge admiration for him and some of the stuff he did, and I wish we had more politicians like him at the forefront of British politics.
I've got to kind of say, in Scotland, he's not held in that high regard, certainly for his role in the independence debate, and hugely controversial figure when we discussed the vow, which was him coming and saying that Scotland will have powers almost like home rule, and having that kind of audacity to say that he was able to deliver that when he was in no position of power, I think speaks to the arrogance of the man. Also feel that that kind of arrogance, and that, as you said, that's why I like that quote about the constipated approach to apologising. I don't think you would get someone like him saying, do you know what, I was wrong on regulation, I was wrong on my role, I was wrong on my role in the independence debate. So, but Russell, thank you so much for spending so much time with us. It's been absolutely fascinating, and we didn't even go into post-austerity, Cameron, and through to Truss and where we are now. Maybe I'll try in a couple of months' time to see if I can get you again to go into that, because I'm sure there's so much to learn from you on that. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed it very much.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Kieran. I hope you enjoyed my interview with Russell. I thought it was really interesting to have his perspective on Scotland, a little bit on Gordon Brown towards the end, and also the great majority of that conversation around the reasons for the demise of the British economy. Kieran, what were your thoughts and your reflections on watching that?
I thought it was an interesting thing that he said about all countries are prisoner to their histories. That's quite an interesting take. I'm sure it doesn't apply to everyone, but also the idea of the UK going cap in hand to the IMF with the sterling crisis in 1976. I think that would be quite a good thing to go over in an episode. Actually, William, I've listened to economists talk about that, and that actually really there was no need for us to go to the IMF. I think that the administration at the time didn't really understand how successful the oil industry would be in reversing their balance of trade. So if they'd understood that better, they probably wouldn't have gone to the IMF.
Yeah. No, let's definitely do that after the festival, because I think it's one of those moments which defined the 70s and led into the 80s and really helped Thatcher when she was speaking about the government as a household, because the whole narrative was that the UK was broke, and we couldn't pay people, we couldn't pay government employees more money because we were broke, and going to the IMF was evidence for that. Whereas, of course, the government as a currency issuer was not broke, cannot be broke. There was a whole different narrative around them, which is definitely worth investigating. Well, we've had some really good comments and questions there. I really enjoyed the interview. It looks like it went down well with our audience. Any final thoughts from anyone who's watching live? And we'll kind of mention them or cover them. We've got a few. It's all, you always know that when you mention Gordon Brown, you're going to get a little bit of interaction. So thanks very much for that. Yeah, I thought the really good thing about Russell was he was very balanced. You could see when he was talking about things, he had a fairly broad view of how the economy works and how it does work. His book was one of our top 5 books, and it's really interesting. I think it's the best review of that period of time from someone who's kind of can be drawn. And as I said in the interview there, his chapter on the financial crisis started discussing Minsky and ended discussing Minsky, who's a really prominent and important heterodox economist. So I think that gives a flavour that he does have a fairly broad view of what went on. Well, thank you very much for joining us. As Hashbury's pointed out, I'm actually on the TNT show on Wednesday to give you a little bit more detail on our festival and also our real world view of the economy. We've got our newsletter in the National tomorrow, which is going to be a little prelude to the budget, trying to focus people's attentions on what the budget should be looking at and not worrying about this idea of fiscal headroom, this complete nonsense of the fiscal headroom. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Next week, we have another interview with Aaron Davis, who's written a similar book called Bubbles, Bankruptcy and Bailouts, which is a real detailed look at the UK Treasury. So again, I think that's really important for us and fundamentally important for our considerations on independence, because the Treasury will still be in charge of our monetary policy post-independence if we continue along the lines that the current government suggests that we should in our post-independence framework. So really interesting interview. I hope you can join us for that. Until then, I'll see some of you on Wednesday, and hopefully I'll see a few of you at our festival in March. Until next week, bye from me.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.